Picture this. It is the year 1350. You have been arrested. You don't know exactly what for. The charge was read aloud in Latin, which you don't speak, by a man whose name you will never learn. You are taken down a set of stairs cut into bedrock. The door behind you closes, and that is the last natural light you will see for a very long time. The cell is roughly the size of a modern bathroom, except there is no floor, just dirt and straw that has not been changed since whoever was here before you. You don't know who that was. You don't know what happened to them. Nobody told you, and frankly, you have started to suspect nobody is going to. It is dark. It is cold. Something in the corner is moving, and you have been here for approximately 6 hours. This is not a dungeon from a movie. This is a dungeon from history, and spending one night here, one night, could genuinely kill you. Today we are going inside the medieval prison, and I will warn you now, some of what you are about to hear is going to make you considerably more grateful for your couch. Here is the first thing that will genuinely surprise you. Medieval prisons, as a concept, were not really designed to punish you. I know, that sounds absurd given everything else I'm about to tell you, but hear me out. In the medieval world, imprisonment was mostly a holding pen. You were locked up while you waited for trial, for ransom to be paid, for the king to decide what to do with you. Long-term incarceration as an actual punishment, that was rare. What you were waiting for was usually something much worse than prison, which means that the prison itself was essentially an afterthought. Nobody spent a lot of time thinking about making it survivable, because that was never really the point. This explains a lot about the conditions. When you are designing a room to hold someone for 6 months while a ransom is negotiated, you are not exactly focused on ventilation. The word dungeon itself comes from the old French word donjon, meaning the great tower of a castle. The lowest levels of these towers, the parts furthest from light, heat, and human activity, that was where you put people you wanted to forget about. And forget about them is precisely what many lords did. Records from medieval England show cases of prisoners dying in custody simply because the jailer forgot to bring food for a week. Not as punishment, just because the jailer had other things going on. That is the level of institutional care we are talking about. You were not a person in a system, you were an item in a storage room, and like most items in storage rooms, you were mostly just left there. There were exceptions, of course. Famous prisoners, wealthy prisoners, politically important prisoners. These individuals were sometimes held in relative comfort. Tower of London inmates with means could bring their own furniture, hire servants, and receive visitors. King Richard II, imprisoned at Pontefract Castle in 1399, was technically held in the same fortress where common prisoners starved. The king's treatment was somewhat better, although given that he appears to have died there of starvation or abuse, the records are not clear, better is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Let us talk about the actual cell. And I want to be specific here, because the specifics are what make this real. The most common form of medieval confinement was the pit prison, also called an oubliette, from the French word oublier, meaning to forget. This was exactly what it sounds like, a hole in the ground, sometimes carved into bedrock, sometimes just a natural cave with a wooden grate placed over the top. The prisoner was lowered in by rope, the grate was replaced, and that was that. The dimensions varied, but many documented oubliettes were between 5 and 8 feet wide and 10 to 15 feet deep. Enough room to stand, not enough room to lie flat without curling your legs. Impossible to climb out of, impossible to see out of. And because the opening was at the top, rain, debris, and the waste products of guards walking above you, all of that had somewhere to go. Now here is a detail that I genuinely could not believe when I first read it. In some oubliettes, the floor was intentionally constructed at a slight angle. Not for drainage, the opposite of drainage. The angle was designed so that the prisoner could never fully sit or lie down without sliding. Sleep was nearly impossible. The body could never fully rest. This was considered an efficient use of architecture. One structure, 2 functions, confinement and sleep deprivation, no extra effort required. For prisoners held in conventional cells rather than pits, conditions varied enormously based on wealth, status, and the mood of the constable running the facility. Newgate Prison in London, which operated from the 11th century onward, was described by contemporaries as a place so crowded with bodies, living, dying, and dead, that the stench was detectable from several streets away. A 14th century account describes a prisoner arriving at Newgate healthy and leaving in a box within 11 days. Not because of any deliberate mistreatment, because of what happened when you crowded that many sick, malnourished, sleep-deprived people in a poorly ventilated stone room with no sanitation. Basic biology did the rest. Let us talk about food, or more accurately, the near total absence of it. In most medieval prisons, the state provided no food. Read that again. The state provided no food. If you were imprisoned, feeding you was not the jailer's responsibility, it was yours, which, given that you were in a hole in the ground, created an obvious logistical challenge. This meant in practice that prisoners survived on three things. First, charity. Local townspeople, religious organizations, and charitable individuals would sometimes bring bread and broth to prison gates. Some prisoners lived entirely on this. Others, at facilities in remote locations or without active charity networks, received nothing. Second, family. If you had relatives who knew where you were and could afford to bring food, you ate. If you didn't, and many prisoners had no idea themselves where they had been taken, that option didn't exist. Third, payment. At facilities like the Tower of London, prisoners who could pay the constable directly could arrange for meals, wine, and firewood. One documented prisoner in the 14th century paid the equivalent of a skilled laborer's monthly wage for a single week's food supply. He described the food as adequate. The formal medieval term for the standard prisoner ration, when one was provided at all, was bread and water. And I don't mean bread and water as a figure of speech. That was the literal official ration. One small loaf of bread per day, dirty water. That's it. Historians analyzing skeletal remains from sites associated with medieval prisons have documented severe malnutrition in individuals who appear to have died in custody. Bone density consistent with months of near starvation, dental evidence of deficiency, bodies that at the time of death weighed far less than a body has any business weighing. These were not casualties of extraordinary cruelty. This was the baseline. This was Tuesday. Here is something that surprises people. In a medieval prison, disease was significantly a bigger killer than any deliberate act of violence. This is not me softening the story. This is just what the records show. The overcrowding, the lack of sanitation, the malnutrition weakening immune systems, the complete absence of anything we would now recognize as hygiene, these conditions created environments in which infectious disease spread with a speed and efficiency that would make a modern epidemiologist deeply uncomfortable. The condition was so well understood at the time that it had a name: jail fever. What we now know to have been epidemic typhus, spread by body lice, which were absolutely everywhere in medieval prisons, was so consistently associated with prisons that contemporaries treated it as essentially part of the prison experience, like the food and the smell. You went to prison, you might get jail fever. Some people survived it, many did not. But here is the detail that puts this in perspective. Jail fever didn't stay in jail. Guards got it. Judges who presided over court sessions where prisoners were brought to trial got it. In 1577, slightly later than our main period, but documenting a centuries-old problem, the Black Assize of Oxford killed the judge, the jury, several witnesses, and hundreds of bystanders at a single court session, all traced back to typhus carried in by the prisoners in the dock. The prisoners, for the record, had largely already been through the worst of the illness and had survived. They were, in the terrible irony of epidemic disease, the immune people in the room. The courtroom of healthy, well-fed, reasonably clean lawyers and noblemen, they had no such advantage. Justice was served, in a manner of speaking. Here is the part of the story that gets talked about least. The physical conditions were brutal. But medieval prisoners who left written accounts, and some did, which is remarkable, described the psychological dimension as something separate and in some ways worse. The complete absence of information about your situation, no trial date, no sentence, no communication from outside, no way of knowing if the people who knew you were free were looking for you or had decided it was safer not to. A 14th century English nobleman named Thomas Wykeham left behind fragments of writing believed to have been scratched into the wall of his cell during a period of imprisonment in the 1360s. In them, he notes that what had begun to disturb him most was not the cold or the hunger, both of which he describes with grim practicality, but the silence. He writes, and I am translating loosely from Middle English here, "The worst of it is not knowing if anyone has yet discovered that I am missing." Read that line twice. Not knowing if anyone has yet discovered that I am missing. This was not an unusual experience. In a world without reliable communication systems, without public records of who was being held where, a person could disappear into a castle dungeon, and their family might spend months simply not knowing if they were dead, imprisoned, or had fled. And the prisoner, of course, had no way of sending word either way. Medieval chroniclers occasionally record the discovery of prisoners who had been forgotten in dungeons for years, not months, years. Found alive, barely, when a castle changed hands or a constable was replaced, and the new occupant went through the lower levels and found, in the dark, someone that the previous administration had simply lost track of. Not all of them were found in time. Now, not all medieval prison stories end in tragedy. Some end in what can only be described as spectacular spite. Take Roger Mortimer, 1st Earl of March, imprisoned in the Tower of London in 1322. Mortimer was one of the most powerful nobles in England. His imprisonment was intended to be permanent. King Edward II had made that fairly clear. What Edward II had not adequately accounted for was that Mortimer was extraordinarily resourceful, had loyal allies on the outside, and was apparently not the kind of person who processed bad news by sitting quietly in a room. In 1323, Mortimer and several associates drugged the garrison's wine supply during a feast celebrating the Feast of St. Peter. While the guards slept off what was presumably one of the more confusing mornings of their careers, Mortimer's men broke through a wall, lowered ropes, and Mortimer climbed out of the Tower of London. He fled to France. He then returned to England, helped overthrow the king, and eventually became the de facto ruler of England. From the Tower of London to running the country in roughly 3 years, which honestly raises the question of whether Edward II had really thought this one through. Then there is the case of one John de Wilton, a somewhat less historically prominent prisoner, recorded at Newgate in 1302, whose entire documented contribution to history is a single court record noting that he had been imprisoned for stealing a pig, 1 blanket, and 3 candles, and that he had subsequently escaped by digging with his hands for a period of no less than 3 weeks. The pig, the record notes, was never recovered. History does not explain what de Wilton wanted with 3 candles, but the man dug through the foundation of a medieval prison with his bare hands over 3 weeks for a pig and a blanket, and I think that deserves at least a footnote. Here is the thing about medieval prisons that stays with me. The people who ended up in them were not primarily hardened criminals in any modern sense. They were debtors, they were political inconveniences, they were people who stood on the wrong side during a power struggle, or said the wrong thing to the wrong person, or simply owed money to someone with more leverage than them. The medieval prison was not primarily a response to violence, it was primarily a response to powerlessness. The wealth gap between a prisoner at Newgate and a prisoner at the Tower of London was not just a gap in comfort, it was the difference between a death sentence by neglect and a temporary inconvenience. One prisoner paid for his own furniture, the other died of typhus before his trial. Both were in prison. The difference was entirely down to resources. That is a sentence worth sitting with for a moment. When you look at the history of confinement, medieval, early modern, modern, one thing stays remarkably consistent across 800 years. The experience of being imprisoned has always had 2 very different versions running simultaneously, and which version you got had very little to do with what you had done. If this is the kind of history that keeps you up at night in the best possible way, drop a comment below. Tell me which part of today's story hit hardest, and tell me where in the world you are watching this from. Because this channel exists because of people who want to actually understand history, not just the version that gets taught in school.